You need to move. The words sliced through the cabin like a blade. She wasn't loud, but how she said it, like Naomi was an inconvenience, like she didn't belong, turned every head in first class. 7 minutes later, the phone at the front of the plane rang. They weren't ready for the name they heard on the other end. Naomi Grant had boarded thousands of flights in her life, but none quite like this one. She stepped through the jet bridge with the kind of confidence that didn't need an audience. Her heels clicked softly against the carpet, and in her hand was a sleek leather laptop bag that looked more like it belonged in a corner office than on an airplane. She wasn't flashy, but she didn't need to be. Her presence was enough to make people look twice, and not just because she was black in first class. She wore a deep navy blazer over a tailored dress, her natural curls framed neatly around her face like a crown. In her eyes, poise. In her posture, authority. And on her boarding pass, seat 1A, first class. But as Naomi made her way toward the front of the cabin, something in the air shifted. Not the temperature. Not the pressure. Something more human. It was subtle at first. A passenger is adjusting their sunglasses to get a better look. A man is lowering his phone mid-scroll. An elderly couple stiffened ever so slightly as she passed. Naomi felt it all. She always did. But she had long since mastered the art of silent defiance. She reached her seat, offered a polite smile to the man already sitting in 1B, and placed her bag in the overhead bin. Then, quietly, she sat down, pulled a pen and a small notebook from her bag, and began writing. She didn't notice the flight attendant watching her from across the cabin. But Heather Barnes did more than just watch. Heather had worked for the airline for nearly 8 years. She knew the layout of every aircraft in their fleet, could quote safety regulations in her sleep, and always wore her uniform like it was armor. But what she lacked in empathy, she made up for in instinct. Or so she believed. The moment she saw Naomi sitting in 1A, Heather felt something clench. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't the ticket. It was the feeling. That gut voice that said, she doesn't belong here. Heather straightened her jacket, pulled her lips into a tight line, and walked toward Naomi's row. "Excuse me," she said with clipped politeness. "May I see your boarding pass?" Naomi looked up, her expression calm but puzzled. She held out her pass without hesitation. "Of course." Heather took it, scanned it, and frowned. "Just slightly. Just enough. This is for first class." Naomi nodded, her voice even. "That's correct." There was a beat of silence. Then Heather returned the pass and walked away without a word. But the damage had already begun. Naomi resumed her writing, refusing to let a moment of profiling ruin her focus. She had a schedule to maintain and a team waiting for her in New York. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and, sadly, it probably wouldn't be the last. But what Naomi didn't know was that Heather wasn't finished. Near the galley, Heather whispered something to a younger flight attendant, casting a glance back toward Naomi. Her body language spoke louder than words. Concern, suspicion, and, perhaps most dangerous of all, entitlement. 3 minutes later, Heather returned, this time with the full weight of her authority behind her. "Miss Grant," she said. "Would you mind stepping aside with me for a moment?" Naomi blinked, confused. "Is there a problem?" "I just need to verify something about your ticket." "Please, this way." Naomi hesitated but remained composed. She stood, taking her laptop bag with her, and followed Heather toward the galley. Passengers murmured behind her. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. The quiet kind of chaos that makes a person feel small, exposed, and outnumbered. When they reached the small corner near the service area, Heather's tone shifted. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the main cabin," she said, arms folded tightly. There seems to have been a mix-up. Naomi frowned. A mix-up? I booked this ticket weeks ago. It was confirmed. I already checked, Heather replied sharply. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. That word is appropriate. Not valid. Not available. Appropriate. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. I'm sorry, but I won't move unless there's a valid reason, Naomi said. Her voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath it. Heather leaned closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. Either you move, or I call security. It's your choice. A breath. A pause. Then Naomi nodded. Quietly. With dignity. She returned to her seat, collected her things, and began the long walk toward the back of the plane. Each step down the aisle felt like a verdict. A trial without a defense. A humiliation too familiar to name. When she finally reached the cramped middle seat in row 23, she sat down, placed her bag beneath her, and stared out the window. To the casual observer, she was calm. But inside, her mind was working at lightning speed. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She typed a short message. Situation on Flight 782. Escalate. Stand by. She hit send. Then smiled. Slightly. 7 minutes. That's all it would take. The flight continued. Drinks were served. Laughter returned to first class. And Heather? Heather moved through the cabin like she'd won something. She didn't notice the ripple behind her. Didn't hear the engine of accountability revving quietly into motion. She didn't see George Harlan watching her with quiet concern. She didn't see Jasmine Cole glance back toward Naomi's new seat with worry. And she didn't hear the flight phone ring near the cockpit. But Naomi did. Her eyes flicked toward the front. She smiled again, this time, with purpose. This wasn't over. Not even close. Heather Barnes thought she had neutralized a threat, rearranged a body out of place. But what she didn't know was that Naomi Grant was never just a passenger. She was a storm in waiting. And the skies were about to change. The overhead lights flickered gently as the plane leveled out at 30,000 feet, but Naomi Grant's mind was already well beyond the cruising altitude. The moment she sat down in the cramped middle seat in row 23B, her dignity stripped in silence and shame, her thoughts shifted, not to anger, not even to pain, but to calculation. That was always her first move. Strategy before emotion. Precision over panic. The man next to her didn't glance her way. The woman in 23C gave a nervous smile, then turned quickly to the window. Naomi didn't blame them. Most people weren't cruel, they were just complicit. Quiet in their comfort. Timid in the face of awkward injustice. She reached into her sleek bag. The velvet inside had been chosen specifically to cradle the three things Naomi never traveled without: a leather-bound notebook, a Montblanc pen, and a matte black smartphone with a military-grade security chip. She turned it on. A familiar interface greeted her, not the standard iOS or Android home screen, but a secure portal built specifically for board members of the airline's parent corporation. She navigated without hesitation. Naomi Grant, verified shareholder access, level 4. Flight 782 status, in air. Incident, discrimination, cabin reassignment. Primary contact, Zoe Lynn, exec assistant. Escalation requested, immediate. With 3 taps and 1 fingerprint, the message was dispatched to the executive liaison team. No emojis. No exclamation points. No threats. Just power, delivered quietly. Heather Barnes was unaware of any of it. In the front of the plane, she was finishing her third pass through the first-class cabin, offering drinks, napkins, and empty smiles to passengers who still, in her eyes, fit the setting. She had even allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. She had acted quickly, decisively. She had corrected what she perceived to be a visual inconsistency. That woman, Naomi, hadn't protested. Hadn't shouted. Hadn't threatened. Heather told herself that meant she had been right. That the problem was handled. Better safe than sorry, she whispered under her breath as she rearranged the ginger ale bottles in the beverage cart. But even as she moved through her routine, Heather's mind replayed the interaction. The calmness in Naomi's eyes. The way she had walked, not sulked. The way she had accepted the humiliation, not with defeat, but with something else. Heather didn't have the language for it. But she was beginning to feel the weight of what she didn't understand. In the cockpit, Captain Lewis Bennett reviewed the urgent alert now blinking on his personal tablet. It was synced to the airline's priority system, used only for high-stakes disruptions, mechanical failure, security threats, executive-level passenger incidents. He narrowed his eyes. Naomi Grant. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Bennett had been on one of the flights Naomi's team had rescued when the airline's software systems were under ransomware attack. Her leadership had saved millions, perhaps the entire global operation. She wasn't just a VIP by title, she was the system. And now, his cabin crew had bumped her from 1A to economy. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, already reaching for the intercom. Ding. Senior flight attendant to the cockpit, please. Ding. Naomi, in the middle of row 23, didn't flinch at the chime. She glanced out the window. Clouds passed slowly beneath them, soft, pale, untouched. In sharp contrast to what was brewing above. She took a deep breath. Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. A message from Zoe Lynn, her assistant back in New York. Alert confirmed. Captain Bennett has received an escalation directive. HR and legal are now looped in. Do you want us to involve press contacts? Naomi typed back, not yet. Then added, let's see how they land the plane. She set the phone aside and picked up her notebook. On a clean page, she wrote. Stillness isn't silence. Some storms begin in whispers. She closed the notebook again. In the galley, George Harlan, the most senior and seasoned of the attendants, gave Heather a nod. Captain's calling for you. Heather blinked. Why? Don't ask me, George said flatly. But go. He didn't sound casual. Heather's stomach turned. She straightened her blouse and walked to the cockpit like someone being summoned to a principal's office. When she stepped inside, the door closed behind her. Captain Bennett didn't look up from his screen at first. Then, do you know who Naomi Grant is? Heather hesitated. She's the passenger I moved from 1A. No, Bennett said calmly, his eyes locking onto hers. She's a senior shareholder of this airline. She sits on the innovation board. She was instrumental in rebuilding our global infrastructure after the 2023 breach. She's not just a passenger, she's one of the reasons you still have a job. Heather's mouth went dry. I didn't know. You didn't ask. Captain Bennett's voice was firm, measured, and cold. You made a call based on instinct. That call may cost this airline millions in PR damage. For now, you will not approach Miss Grant. Not unless there's a fire. Understood? Heather nodded stiffly. You'll file a written report the moment we land. And pray that's all she asks for. Back in the economy, Naomi received another ping. Confirmed. Captain notified. Immediate compliance initiated. Corporate comms on standby. She let the screen dim and placed the phone back into her bag. There was no satisfaction on her face. No smugness. Just quiet readiness. Across the aisle, a passenger in a gray sweater leaned slightly toward her. "That flight attendant," he said, voice low, "she gave you a hard time, didn't she?" Naomi looked at him. Her eyes were soft, her voice even. "It's nothing I haven't survived before." The man blinked, unsure how to respond. Naomi gave a faint smile to let him off the hook. It wasn't his fight. But this time, it would not be ignored. In the galley, Heather was pacing. She didn't speak to George. Didn't smile at passengers. Didn't correct the placement of a single napkin. She was unraveling. George finally broke the silence. "She didn't cause trouble, you know." Heather looked up. "Miss Grant," he added. "She didn't raise her voice. Didn't make a scene." "That's what makes it worse," Heather muttered. "She just let it happen." "Maybe," George said slowly, "because she knew she didn't need to yell." Heather's jaw clenched. She didn't look like someone who. George's voice cut in, low but sharp. "Someone who what?" Heather looked away. George didn't press further. He just shook his head, returned to his task. He had seen it before. He would see it again. But this one felt different. Naomi sat motionless in her seat as the cabin resumed its rhythm. But beneath her calm exterior, she was documenting every word, every whisper, every silence that spoke volumes. She thought about the passengers who watched and said nothing. She thought about Clara, the young attendant who had offered her water with kindness, unaware of the magnitude of what she was witnessing. She thought about Zoe, already coordinating legal. And she thought about the system, how many women like her had been asked to move, silenced with a smile, and walk to the back of a room they'd already earned a seat in. Naomi wasn't interested in vengeance. She was building a case. One that wouldn't just shake the crew. It would rattle the pillars they stood on. Heather thought the worst was over when Naomi sat quietly in row 23. But the moment the cockpit door closed behind her, she realized. She hadn't ended a problem. She had just unleashed it. Heather Barnes walked out of the cockpit with her breath shallow, her fingers trembling at her sides, her thoughts loud enough to drown out the hum of the plane. Her cheeks still stung from Captain Bennett's reprimand. She'd never been spoken to like that before. Not in uniform. Not in front of the command. But it wasn't just his words that rattled her. It was the name. Naomi Grant. She didn't know exactly who Naomi was, but the way the captain had said her name, with the weight of someone naming a storm, had hit Heather like a cold splash of reality. "She's the reason you still have a job." Those words echoed louder than the engines. As she reached the galley again, George Harlan stood waiting with arms crossed. His eyes scanned her face, and he didn't need to ask. He already knew. "Bad," he muttered. Heather gave the faintest nod. He said, "She's with the board." "Like, the board." George exhaled through his nose. "Told you. You picked the wrong person to challenge." Heather lowered her voice, suddenly self-conscious. "I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I was just protecting the cabin." "From what?" George asked. Heather hesitated. She didn't look. She caught herself. But the sentence hung in the air like secondhand smoke. George shook his head and walked away. Back in 23B, Naomi remained still. Every movement around her passed like slow theater, passengers flipping through magazines, others ordering drinks, a child 2 rows up giggling at a cartoon. But Naomi? Naomi was listening to everything. The whispers. The looks. The energy shift that came after Heather returned from the cockpit, less certain, less dominant, less untouchable. Naomi didn't need to stand up to be powerful. She had already tilted the room. Across the aisle, the man in gray leaned closer again. "I think they're talking about you up there." Naomi turned her head slightly, offering a faint smile. "They should be," she said softly. Then she returned to her notebook and wrote. "Some tides turn with a crash. Others begin with a tremor. This one started in seat 1A. In the crew break corner, Heather sat down for a minute, trying to collect herself. She scrolled through the flight app on her work tablet, reviewing passenger notes. No incident reports yet. No written complaints. Yet. She tapped Naomi's name. No red flags. No alerts. Just Naomi Grant. Shareholder level 4. Do not reassign without direct approval. Her heart skipped. There it was, in plain digital ink. A directive she had ignored. A rule she hadn't even checked before acting. It wasn't just a mistake. It was negligence. And if Naomi pushed this far enough, Heather could lose everything. Jasmine Cole, the youngest flight attendant on board, was making her way through the cabin with drink refills when she stopped at row 23. She knelt slightly beside Naomi. "Miss Grant," she said quietly, her tone warmer than it had been the first time, "can I offer you anything else? Something hot, maybe?" Naomi looked up. The kindness in Jasmine's eyes was genuine. "No, thank you. But I appreciate you checking in." Jasmine hesitated, then leaned closer. "If it means anything. I saw how she treated you. And I'm sorry." Naomi studied her for a moment. Then gave a single, sincere nod. "It means more than you know." As Jasmine walked away, Naomi made a mental note: protect her. Promote her. The system was full of people like Heather. But it survived on people like Jasmine. In the cockpit, the captain received another notification, this one from internal communications. Confirmed, the executive review team has opened a live incident file. Legal has flagged this as a potential high-impact bias incident. PR team on standby. Senior Director requests full compliance with the Passenger Protection Protocol. Subject, Naomi Grant. Bennett rubbed his temples. This wasn't a flight anymore. This was a case. And his name was attached. Meanwhile, in the galley, George was watching Heather attempt to collect herself. He walked over, his tone gentle but firm. "You want to talk?" Heather didn't look up. "What's there to say?" "I've worked a long time on these flights," George said. "Long enough to know when someone steps into something deep. You're knee-deep right now." "I didn't mean to humiliate her," Heather whispered. "I just reacted." George nodded. "That's the problem. Reactions without thought. That's how discrimination stays alive." Heather snapped, "I'm not racist." "I didn't say you were," he said calmly. "But bias isn't about who you think you are. It's about what you do without thinking." Heather bit her lip. She looked away. "I thought she didn't belong in first class." George folded his arms. "And now you're learning that the problem isn't where she sat. It's where you placed her in your mind." Heather had no response. Only silence. In 23B, Naomi felt her phone buzz again. Zoe Lynn had forwarded the internal summary of the escalation. It was happening. The system was working. The wheel had turned. And Heather? She was no longer the authority here. She was the subject of a review. Naomi typed out a message to Zoe. "I want a note added to her file. If she's retained, she must undergo advanced bias retraining. But also flagged Jasmine Cole for internal promotion review. Zoe replied within seconds. Understood. You're already changing the system. Quietly. Naomi looked up from the screen. Her posture didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. But in the space between breath and breath, power changed hands. Heather now moved through the cabin as if on eggshells. Her smile was mechanical. Her tone was too rehearsed. Passengers could sense something had happened, even if they didn't know what. But Naomi knew. And more importantly, so did Jasmine. As the plane continued east, clouds rolling like silk outside the windows, Naomi turned once more to her notebook and began a fresh page. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply refuses to leave, even when you try to evict it. She smiled faintly. She would stay seated. But not silent. Not anymore. Heather thought she'd regained control by returning to her duties. But the truth was spreading. And while the cabin was calm, the cracks in her confidence had already started to show, visible to anyone who cared to look. The beverage cart rattled slightly as Heather pushed it down the aisle, her hands gripping the handle tighter than necessary. Her smile was thin, lips stretched across clenched teeth. She handed out drinks to first-class passengers, iced ginger ale, black coffee, tonic water with lime, and offered forced laughter in response to their casual chatter. But her mind was elsewhere. It kept circling back to that name. Naomi Grant. The name now burned behind her eyes like a warning label. Every time she glanced down the length of the plane, she could feel it, an invisible thread pulling her gaze toward the woman she'd dismissed without second thought. A woman who had, without raising her voice, set off a chain reaction powerful enough to unseat a cockpit. Heather tried to focus. She adjusted her uniform for the third time that hour. Checked her lipstick in the reflection of the galley panel. Repeated the standard safety phrases in her head, like a prayer. But she couldn't shake it. The weight of her decision was settling into her bones. And it was getting heavier by the minute. Naomi, meanwhile, sat calmly in 23B. To anyone watching, she looked like any other passenger, reading quietly, sipping water, occasionally glancing at the flight tracker screen on the seat back ahead. But her thoughts moved with surgical precision. She had already sent Zoe a summary of Heather's post-cockpit behavior, along with a request for timestamps. Every subtle gesture mattered. Every flicker of unease. She was documenting, not to punish, but to clarify. To expose the invisible mechanics of why this always happened. And more importantly, how to stop it. Beside her, the man in gray leaned over again. "Do you want me to say something?" he asked quietly. I saw what happened earlier." Naomi looked at him for a moment, her gaze soft but direct. "No," she replied. "But I hope you remember it." He blinked. "Remember? Next time you see it happening to someone else," she said. "You'll know it wasn't in their head." He nodded slowly, as if the words had settled somewhere he hadn't expected. At the front of the plane, George Harlan watched Heather struggle. He didn't say anything, yet, but his silence was louder than her forced professionalism. He'd seen it before, the panic hidden behind politeness, the nervous sweat behind the smiles. It was what happened when someone realized, too late, that they had misjudged the playing field. And Heather wasn't just on thin ice. She was skating over a crack. "Passenger in 2A asked for a refill," he said, handing her a tray. Heather took it automatically, grateful for the distraction. But the tray trembled slightly in her hands. Jasmine Cole moved through the coach section with a different energy. She carried a small notebook in her pocket, one she had begun using after her first week on the job. It held notes that had nothing to do with food orders or aisle numbers. It was filled with moments. Small ones. Things the other crew overlooked. A nervous teenager with a nosebleed. An old man who cried quietly into his boarding pass. A black woman, alone, in 23B, who had once sat in 1A. Jasmine approached Naomi again, quietly offering a small snack tray and warm tea. Her hands were steady. Her tone was soft. Naomi accepted it with a polite nod. "You're a rare one," she said quietly to Jasmine. The young attendant looked surprised. "Me?" Naomi smiled. "Yes. And I hope the right people notice." Jasmine smiled back. "Some already have." Then she moved on. Heather returned to the galley and leaned against the counter, her pulse thudding in her ears. She pulled out her work tablet and refreshed the internal crew chat. New message. Executive Liaison notification, ongoing review active. Please ensure no additional interaction with subject Naomi Grant unless directed. Be advised, all crew activity is being monitored for procedural compliance. Heather's stomach dropped. They were watching. She had hoped the captain's warning was the extent of it. But now, her every move, her every word, was potentially evidence. She took a deep breath and steadied her hands. But her breath shook as it left her. Back in the coach, Naomi placed her empty cup gently on the tray. She checked the time. 2 hours to landing. Plenty of time. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Zoe. Media team aware. No leaks yet. The exec board is holding an emergency Zoom tonight. The CEO wants a preliminary readout. I told them we'll have documentation by touchdown. Naomi typed back. Hold press. But let them know we're watching response, not just words. She closed the phone again. It was never just about punishment. It was about precedent. Meanwhile, a small ripple of whispers began to move through the passengers. First class had noticed the tension. A couple asked George if everything was all right. A man in row 3 whispered to his wife about that woman who'd been moved. In the coach, it spread more subtly. A young student had overheard Naomi's name. She was typing it into Google on her phone now. Her eyes widened as she scrolled. Whoa, she whispered to herself. Within 5 minutes, 4 passengers on the plane had quietly realized that Naomi Grant was someone, not because she had shouted it, but because the internet made the truth hard to bury. Heather, unfortunately, hadn't considered that. But the cabin had. And that changed everything. George stepped into the galley again. He saw Heather gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles pale. You need to breathe, he said. I'm trying. He nodded. You know what I noticed about Naomi, he said. Heather glanced at him, wary. She never raised her voice. Not once. Never made it a scene. Never challenged you publicly. So. Heather replied defensively. So that tells me she didn't need to, he said. Because the room bends around people like her. Quietly. Eventually. Heather didn't reply. Because somewhere deep down, she knew he was right. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet and expect an on-time arrival into JFK. Please let your crew know if you need anything during the remainder of the flight. The announcement sounded ordinary. But to Naomi, it was confirmation. The system was stabilizing. But not for Heather. Heather made one last walk through the aisles before landing prep. As she passed 23B, Naomi didn't look up. Didn't need to. Heather, however, did look down. Just for a moment. Their eyes met. There was no anger in Naomi's gaze. Just clarity. And that was worse. Because it meant Naomi didn't need revenge. She already had a resolution. The plane was beginning its descent. But for Heather Barnes, it wasn't altitude that was dropping. It was her certainty. Her composure. And the carefully maintained mask of control she'd worn for 8 years. Was cracking. The seatbelt sign blinked on with its familiar chime. Passengers began shifting in their seats. A baby started crying softly 2 rows behind Naomi. Tray tables snapped back into place. Windows closed. Devices off. Flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin for final checks, but the tension in their steps betrayed the truth. This descent was not routine. Heather stood at the front of the first class, hands folded, smile thin and uneven. She was supposed to be confirming seatbacks were upright. Instead, she was watching the cockpit door like it might open and swallow her whole. It hadn't been just the captain's voice over the intercom that had her rattled. It was the looks. The glances from George. The way Jasmine moved, quiet, focused, but more self-assured than she had been earlier. And worse, the murmurs from passengers. They had started small, but now Heather could feel them. Floating just under the surface of polite conversation. Words like shareholder, complaint, and repercussions. And always, Naomi Grant. The name followed her now like a shadow. She picked up a silver tray with trembling fingers, placing 3 glasses of water on it, trying to steady her breath. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she began walking down the aisle toward the economy. Toward row 23. Naomi saw her coming before she even stood. The body language gave it away, the hesitant steps, the shallow breath, the way Heather avoided eye contact with other passengers as she walked. A performance was coming. One Naomi had seen before. The tray arrived first. A glass of sparkling water with a lemon wedge. Unasked for. Unnecessary. Then came the apology. "Miss Grant," Heather began, her voice lower than normal. I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience earlier. It was." She paused. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Yes." Heather swallowed. "It was a misunderstanding. On my part." Naomi didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, not unkindly, but with weight. "A misunderstanding," Naomi echoed, her voice quiet but firm. "What exactly did you misunderstand, Ms. Barnes?" Heather hesitated. "I assumed, wrongly, that your seat assignment wasn't correct." Naomi gave a slow nod. "You assumed." Heather's grip on the tray tightened. "I didn't mean to cause discomfort." Naomi looked at her, not unkindly, but clearly. "Yet you did." Heather's throat moved as she swallowed again. Naomi leaned back in her seat. Her voice remained calm. Measured. "I think," she said, "it's going to take more than a glass of water to fix this." She didn't say it with venom. She didn't need to. The words alone landed like stone. Heather bowed her head slightly. "Of course. If there's anything else I can do." "I believe," Naomi interrupted, "the airline will handle it." Heather stood for a second longer, frozen. Then nodded stiffly, turned, and walked away, back up the aisle toward the front of the plane, tray clutched like a lifeline, ears burning with shame. Jasmine watched the entire exchange from 2 rows behind. She said nothing. But when Heather passed her on the way back, their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. Heather looked away first. George, at the front, saw her return and didn't say a word. He just stepped aside to let her pass. Heather slipped behind the galley curtain and finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She placed the tray down. then leaned against the counter. Her hand trembled as she reached for the safety manual, anything to keep her fingers from shaking in plain view. She had delivered the apology. She had done the right thing. But why didn't it feel like enough? Naomi took a slow sip of the water. The lemon was cut too thick, and the fizz was too warm. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about beverages. It was about boundaries. About dignity. And now, finally, someone had been made to see it. The cabin began to dim slightly as the plane prepared for landing. Outside, the clouds had thinned, revealing a gray skyline far below. The world moved on, unaware that a reckoning had just unfolded 30,000 feet above it. But Naomi knew. And so did Heather. The tires touched down with a gentle bump. The familiar pull of deceleration pressed everyone into their seats. Seat belts clicked. Bags shifted. Heads turned toward the windows, eager for arrival. But Naomi remained still. She didn't rush to gather her things. She didn't unbuckle. She waited. Because she knew the landing wasn't the end. It was just the threshold. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Zoe. Security team on site. Legal notified. Internal report triggered. The director of ops is waiting by the gate. We'll be ready when you disembark. Naomi replied with a single word, understood. At the front of the plane, Heather's chest tightened with every second the plane taxied toward the gate. She kept her hands folded, but her mind raced. What would happen when they opened the doors? Would someone be waiting? Would she be pulled aside? Fired? She glanced down the cabin again. Naomi hadn't moved. That scared her more than anything. No shouting. No threats. Just stillness. And power. As the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers stood and began the familiar shuffle, grabbing bags, stretching limbs, checking phones. Naomi remained seated. She waited until the aisle had cleared, until only a few rows remained. Then, slowly, she rose. She gathered her bag with grace, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. One step at a time, she moved forward, past the passengers who had pretended not to notice, past those who had Googled her name in secret, past the flight attendants who stood rigidly at the front. When she reached the door, Heather tried to speak again. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice hoarse. Naomi paused. Looked at her. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied. And walked off the plane. Heather stood frozen. The words echoed long after Naomi was gone. George approached quietly. "You okay?" Heather shook her head. "No." And this time, she didn't pretend. The wheels touched down, but not everyone walked away with dignity. For Heather Barnes, the real descent began on solid ground. And this time, she had no aisle to disappear into. The jet bridge connected with a heavy thud. For most passengers, the noise was unremarkable, just another step in the ritual of arrival. But for Heather, it sounded like a verdict. She stood stiffly near the exit, shoulder to shoulder with George and Jasmine. Her hands were folded in front of her, but her fingers trembled slightly. Her smile had vanished. Her jaw was tight. She had always been composed, always knew how to hold face in front of passengers, in front of captains, even in front of chaos. But this wasn't turbulence. This was accountability. Naomi Grant had stepped off the aircraft exactly 90 seconds ago, calm, precise, without a backward glance. Now Heather was waiting, not for passengers, but for consequences. Outside the aircraft, Naomi walked calmly through the terminal. Her heels tapped against polished tiles, echoing through the corridor like a drumbeat no one else could hear. Ahead, Two individuals in black suits waited, discreet but unmistakably corporate. One of them stepped forward. "Miss Grant," he said with a respectful nod. "Security and legal liaison. May we walk with you?" "Of course," Naomi replied. They didn't speak further. They didn't need to. Naomi wasn't rushing. She had planned for this. Back on the plane, Heather turned to George, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she's going to press charges?" George looked at her, then away. "I think," he said slowly, "she doesn't have to. The system will press them for her." Heather's heart dropped. The last group of passengers exited. Then the voice came over the intercom. "Flight crew, please remain on board until clearance is granted." Heather's stomach clenched. That was not standard protocol for a routine domestic arrival. It was the kind of code used when someone was being detained. And she had a sickening feeling it wasn't Naomi. Naomi reached the executive lounge. She entered not as a passenger, but as a stakeholder. The room was quiet, well lit, with glass walls and brushed metal finishes. Modern. Professional. Cold. Waiting for her at the conference table was a woman in her 50s, gray at the temples, sharp in both fashion and posture. Her name was Marissa Greer, Director of Operations. "Miss Grant," Marissa said, standing. "We appreciate you agreeing to meet so quickly." Naomi gave a slight nod. "I expect you understand the urgency." "We do. The board's already received Zoe's initial report. We've opened an internal case and escalated it to HR and corporate legal. I want to be very clear, we take this seriously." Naomi sat. Marissa didn't. On the aircraft, the internal crew phone rang. George answered it. Then turned to Heather. "They want to speak with you. In person." Heather blinked. "Now." George nodded. "Security details boarding. They're asking for you by name." Heather stepped back, her pulse spiking. She tried to mask it, but even Jasmine noticed. Within seconds, two men in airport security vests entered the front of the plane. "Miss Heather Barnes?" one of them asked. Heather nodded. "Yes. We need to escort you to a private interview room for a post-incident debrief. You are not under arrest, but you are required to comply under internal policy protocol." Heather looked at George. He gave her a single, slow nod. "Go," he said gently. "Say everything you need to say. And tell the truth." Heather stepped forward and followed the two officers off the aircraft. Passengers in the gate area turned to stare as she passed, some curious, others confused. No one spoke. But Jasmine? Jasmine watched it all. And she felt something shift inside her. In the lounge, Naomi and Marissa reviewed the tablet screen between them. Statements were already being filed by the crew. Passenger accounts were being collected. Jasmine Cole's name had already appeared in two. "She stood out," Naomi said. "In the right way." "We've already flagged her for fast-track leadership review," Marissa replied. "We'll notify her officially once the flight logs are finalized." Naomi gave a subtle nod. "And Heather?" Marissa's voice lost its corporate polish. "She's on borrowed time. She needs to be removed," Naomi said plainly. "But not just her. The system that made her believe she could act with impunity. That's what matters." Marissa leaned forward. "Then help us fix it." "I already am," Naomi replied. And she was. Heather sat in a cold, windowless room. One table. Two chairs. One clock on the wall, ticking far too loudly. Across from her sat a security officer and an HR representative. Their expressions were professional, unreadable. "Miss Barnes," the HR officer began, "this isn't an interrogation. This is a formal review of your conduct during Flight 782, involving a first-class passenger and subsequent cabin reassignment." Heather licked her lips. "I was just doing my job. You removed a verified shareholder from their confirmed seat without documented cause. I didn't know she was a shareholder. You were required to check passenger flags before seat changes. That's part of your pre-flight briefing checklist." Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. They continued. "Do you understand why this is being treated as a policy-level incident?" Heather looked down at her hands. "I thought she didn't belong there," she whispered. Silence. Then, finally, the HR rep asked, "And why did you think that?" Heather's face flushed. Her voice cracked. "I don't know." But they both knew that wasn't true. Naomi stood at the window of the lounge, watching the terminal buzz below her. People came and went, dragging suitcases, pushing strollers, sipping coffee. No one knew what had just happened at Gate 42. But they would. Zoe's voice crackled over Naomi's secure earpiece. "News embargo remains in place. The board is reviewing your proposals tonight. The CEO has approved your preliminary outline for the staff-wide retraining initiative. Full implementation possible within 90 days. Naomi's lips curved slightly. "Make it 60. Back in the crew room, George placed a call. It rang twice. Then, "Clara? Hey. It's George. Listen. There's something happening today I think you'll want to pay attention to. I'll fill you in when you're back." He hung up. Then looked across the gate. At Jasmine. She was still there. Still watching. She'd seen enough to learn something important today. Silence was no longer an option. Heather emerged from the interview room 1 hour later, pale and unsteady. A printed document sat in her hand, her formal notice of indefinite administrative suspension pending disciplinary review. Her badge had been collected. Her uniform felt heavier than it ever had. She made her way out of the secure wing without speaking to anyone. No one greeted her. No one stopped her. And no one apologized. For the first time in her career, she was the one being escorted out. Naomi returned to her office in the city before sunset. The skyline shimmered through her window. Her assistant Zoe handed her a thick folder labeled Flight 782, Incident Response Package. Internal Complaint Protocol Reform. Mandatory Staff-Wide Retraining. Leadership Evaluation Overhaul. Public Messaging Draft. Naomi flipped through the pages with surgical efficiency. She had no interest in revenge. She wanted results. And now she was holding them. Heather used to believe she understood professionalism, procedure, protocol, control. But sitting alone, stripped of her badge and dignity, she realized what she mistook for order was biased in a blazer. Heather Barnes sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment, still wearing the uniform she hadn't had the nerve to take off. The collar pinched at her neck. The sleeves, usually crisp and pressed with pride, now felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone she no longer recognized. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the next morning. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. A manila envelope from the airline's HR department sat unopened beside her half-drunk glass of wine. She had read the email version already, but the hard copy felt heavier. More final. She didn't want to touch it. She had told herself she was just following instinct. Just protecting the integrity of the cabin. But now, without the hum of jet engines to drown out her thoughts, the truth pressed louder. She had judged Naomi Grant. She had reduced her to an assumption. And she had done it with a smile. Naomi, in contrast, was already 2 steps ahead. She sat in a quiet conference room on the 36th floor of the airline's headquarters. Her blazer was open, her tone calm but decisive as she addressed the board's internal audit committee. The issue, she said, isn't isolated to Heather Barnes. She is a symptom, not the disease. The room fell still. A few board members shifted in their chairs. Not out of disagreement, but discomfort. Because she was right. We have protocols, yes, Naomi continued, but what we don't have is accountability culture. We have checklists, but no consciousness. That ends now. She slid a thin folder across the table. Inside. A 60-day bias retraining rollout. A new seat reassignment policy was implemented that required managerial clearance. A performance review flag for staff with repeated bias incidents. A merit-based recognition plan for employees like Jasmine Cole. I'm not asking for these, Naomi said. I'm implementing them. No one challenged her. They wouldn't dare. Heather spent the rest of her evening in silence. She didn't call anyone. She didn't scroll through social media. She didn't text her mother, who had left 3 voicemails, or her best friend Kara, who had sent a single text that read, "Are you okay?" She wasn't. And she didn't know how to say that. What haunted her wasn't just what she'd done. It was the quiet way Naomi had handled it. The restraint. The calm. The power that didn't need to yell. It was the grace that unnerved her most. Because Heather hadn't just attacked Naomi's place in first class. She had attacked her right to belong. And Naomi had responded not with outrage, but with orchestration. At 7 a.m., Heather arrived at the disciplinary hearing. She wore a gray suit, simple and safe. No airline logo. No wings. Just silence wrapped in fabric. The panel was already waiting. A senior VP from HR. A legal liaison. A board representative from Naomi's side of the table. Heather's throat went dry. They invited her to speak. She stood. And for the first time, she didn't defend. She admitted. I didn't follow the verification protocol. I didn't check the flight manifest. I made an assumption based on how she looked. She paused, searching for courage. Then added. And I now understand that assumption was rooted in bias. The room was still. She continued, voice steadier. I've never thought of myself as prejudiced. But prejudice doesn't need to wear a uniform. It hides in impulse. In comfort. In unchecked instinct. And I see that now. No one interrupted. She took a breath. I don't expect to be forgiven. I don't expect to be reinstated. But I do want the chance to change, and I want to help change the environment that made me believe what I did was acceptable. She sat. The panel didn't offer sympathy. But they did take notes. And in that quiet, Heather realized. The consequence had become her classroom. Naomi reviewed the hearing transcript that afternoon. Zoe had sent it over with a note. She owned it. No excuses. Naomi read Heather's words twice. She didn't smile. But she did close the file slowly, like someone placing a book on a shelf, not because it was finished, but because its chapter was complete. She texted Zoe. Forward this to Marissa. Tell her Heather should not return to the cabin, but offer her a position in the diversity training task force, if she requests it. Zoe's response came instantly. Seriously? After all that? Naomi replied. Growth doesn't happen in exile. It happens when you're made to face what you broke, and help rebuild it. That evening, Heather received an unexpected email. From Zoe Lynn. Subject line, an opportunity. The message was short, clear, and unlike anything Heather had expected. We've reviewed your statement. You will not be returning to flight operations at this time. However, if you're serious about rebuilding, the Director of Operations is inviting you to assist in the implementation of our new equity training model. If you're ready to learn, we're ready to involve you. Heather stared at the screen. Then, for the first time in 48 hours, she cried. Not out of fear, but out of something quieter, harder, necessary. Remorse. And maybe, just maybe, relief. Back at headquarters, Naomi watched the sun disappear behind the skyline. She poured a glass of water. Turned her chair to face the window. Some would say the battle was over. But she knew better. This wasn't a victory. It was a beginning. Because culture doesn't change overnight. It changes decision by decision. Policy by policy. Person by person. And sometimes, by giving those who broke it a chance to help repair it. She opened her notebook. Wrote 5 words on a fresh page. Accountability begins where ego ends. She underlined it once. Closed the cover. And turned to tomorrow. One woman stood her ground without raising her voice. One policy changed. And across hundreds of gates, thousands of uniforms. The ripple began to move. 2 weeks later, Naomi Grant boarded another flight. Same airline. Same terminal. Different atmosphere. As she stepped into the cabin, something felt quieter. Not in volume, but in resistance. The glances were still there, but they didn't linger. The whispers had softened into recognition, not suspicion. And when she reached her seat, 1A again, no one asked to see her boarding pass. She placed her bag into the overhead compartment and sat down slowly. There was no triumph in her posture. Just steadiness. The kind that comes not from being right, but from having endured. Across the aisle, a young black woman with short braids was adjusting her tote bag. She looked nervous, her first time flying business class, maybe. Her hand fumbled slightly as she reached for her seatbelt. A flight attendant appeared, calm, kind, composed. "Let me help you with that," she said warmly. Naomi watched as the woman nodded gratefully. The attendant fastened the belt gently, made a soft joke, and moved on. No tension. No questioning. Just service. It was subtle. But it was different. In the rear of the cabin, Jasmine Cole stood with a new badge clipped to her uniform. Senior Flight Coordinator. She had been promoted exactly 5 days after Naomi submitted her formal commendation to the board. The recognition wasn't loud or grand. But it was real. And Jasmine had accepted it not with fanfare, but with focus. Because she knew now, her role wasn't just to serve drinks and check belts. Her role was to see people. And make sure they were seen. At headquarters, the airline's CEO sat beside Naomi in a polished conference room as final plans for the Equity in Altitude program were signed into motion. Bias retraining. Passenger dignity protocols. A confidential reporting system is monitored independently. Naomi didn't ask for credit. But she received it anyway, in the form of actions, not awards. That was how she preferred it. Change doesn't live in slogans, she had told them. It lives in systems. And Heather? She was in a classroom. No overhead bins. No carts. No rows of passengers. Just a whiteboard, a notepad, and 12 new trainees in the Diversity Task Force orientation. She stood in front of them, not as an expert, but as a case study. "I'm not here to teach," she said. I'm here because I got it wrong. And I'm staying because I want to help others get it right. Some attendees looked skeptical. Others curious. One woman raised her hand and asked, "So, what made you change?" Heather paused. Then answered truthfully. "I saw what happens when you meet dignity with assumption, and how quietly power can respond." The ripple extended further than anyone expected. Other airlines requested access to Naomi's training framework. A major publication ran a piece titled Seat 1A and the Silent Revolution. Airports started re-evaluating their onboarding materials for staff. And quietly, across terminals and continents, conversations began. Not about rage. Not about scandal. But about change. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that starts with one person standing their ground. And refusing to be moved. Naomi didn't speak of the incident often after that. She didn't need to. Her presence, her leadership, her stillness had already become part of the culture. Not as a symbol, but as a reminder. That dignity cannot be reassigned. No uniform justifies injustice. That the quietest woman in the room may be the one steering the course of history. As she prepared for landing on this new flight, Naomi opened her notebook, now more filled than ever. Her pen hovered briefly, then she wrote. What we tolerate becomes our culture. What we correct becomes our legacy. She looked out the window. The sky stretched endlessly before her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like it belonged to her. This story is not just about a plane. Or a policy. Or a seat. It's about the power of one person standing in quiet defiance. About a woman who chose not to shout, but to act. Who refused to let humiliation go unanswered, but didn't seek revenge. She sought reform. In a world where assumptions are easy and bias often hides behind protocol, Naomi Grant reminds us that transformation is possible. It starts when we listen. When we reflect. When we choose to see people not for where they sit, but for who they are. To everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. You do. And the system is changing. Because of you. Let this story ripple further. Let it reach the ones who need it most. Let it live in boardrooms, break rooms, and boarding gates. And most importantly, let it remind us. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it lands softly. But when it does, it changes everything. In a world where prejudice often hides behind professionalism and routine, Naomi Grant's story is a powerful reminder that dignity doesn't have to shout to be heard. When she was publicly humiliated and judged by appearance, Naomi didn't respond with outrage, she responded with intelligence, poise, and unwavering resolve. She didn't just defend her seat, she changed the system for everyone else who would come after her. The deeper lesson here is this: we always have a choice, to stay silent or to create change. And sometimes, change doesn't begin with a grand revolution, but with a quiet act of courage, done at the right moment by the right person. Let this story remind us that real leadership is often invisible until it becomes undeniable. You don't need a title to stand tall. You need clarity, conviction, and compassion. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories that awaken empathy and inspire transformation. We're not just telling stories, we're reshaping how the world listens.